Hi everyone, I'm Les,
And I'm Ashley.
and you're listening to Anthropology, where we explore some of your favorite anthropology topics.
Hey everyone, welcome to the latest episode of Anthropotamus. We're here today with Rue Marshall discussing the book American Trickster, The Hidden Lives of Carlos Castaneda. They are a non-binary writer and visual artist. Rue previously wrote A Separate Reality, which was released in 2006 and nominated for a Lambda Award. Rue, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to talk with you guys.
So before we get into the book, please tell our listeners about yourself, your background, and what led you to write American Trickster.
Wow, well, it was a really circuitous route and story to start off with. I know most of the people you talk with on here are anthropologists. I'm not an anthropologist, but many years ago, called the 70s, I was in middle school and I a bit precociously began reading the books of Carlos Castaneda, which had an enormous impact on me at the time. And I read the first four of them. I think it was somewhere in the middle of book four that I began to think there's something just kind of amiss about that. And then many years passed, and I really did not start writing seriously until I was in my mid 30s, and I began to work on a novel. And the novel is my elevator pitch is that it's a queer, new age crisis of faith novel. And yeah, it was about dealing with those issues, during the heyday of Castaneda. But I wasn't really thinking about him specifically then. And when that book, A Separate Reality, came out, my agent said, "Oh, you should think about writing some kind of short nonfiction accompaniment piece because basically nobody reads literary fiction, so gotta hook them in any way we can." And the first thought that came to me was, oh, whatever happened to Carlos Castaneda? Because nobody knew who he was or knew anything about him. It was very mysterious. And I think I'd seen the obituary that he had died, but I didn't really know a thing. So I went online and Googled around and came across this little article that appeared in the Pahrump Valley Times, and I may be mispronouncing Pahrump, Nevada. I apologize if so. And it was about the discovery of the skeleton of his adopted daughter and lover, Nuri Alexander, in Death Valley. It's like, what the fuck? What? Um, so yeah, I just started looking further. I came into contact with a woman named Amy Wallace, who had written a memoir about her time as one of Castaneda's lovers and as part of his cult, which I knew nothing about then. And I spent 3 hours on the phone with her. I was like, how can I not write about this? Because I no one has seemed to have really gone into it. So I was, tired of writing kind of in introspective, subjective, literary fiction type stuff. I was like, I'll do this thing that's going to be about, the real world and facts and so forth, and I'll spend 2 or 3 years on it. And it kind of turned out to be, I think we can still make references to Gilligan's Island. It's like, oh, we're going to go on a 3 hour tour. This ended up being a 20-year journey, because it's one of those things where, oh, we just would go down one rabbit hole, and then there was a rabbit hole in the rabbit hole, and I kept thinking, I'll get it done in another 2 years, but at that point, oh, you've spent 5 years, you don't want to give up, so you're going to give it it just went on and on, and then I think maybe we'll get to this later. Getting it published was quite an experience, and so here we are.
So, okay. So first of all,
Yeah,
why is this not on Audible? Uh,
not on
this is,
Audible.
yeah, not on Audible. This
You
needs to be an audiobook.
Yeah, preach. That's yeah, waiting to hear from my publisher. I think it should be, and I have faith that that it will be.
So, probably gonna go on a tangent here. So, I travel from Sacramento to Merced every Friday to see my grandfather. That's a 2-hour drive minimum.
Yeah.
So, when I started reading your book, I was like, oh, I'll just sit down while I'm there and start reading it. And, I'm there for a couple hours. I was like, man, I wish I could just keep going. So I go, I was like, well, maybe there's an Audible book. And I go, and there's no Audible book. And I was like, well, what am I supposed to do now? I can't read it while I drive.
Oh,
So then,
thank you. Thank you for that. No, I mean, I will just say, the publishing industry is in everyone is very skittish about about anything, and they're very very cautious, and it's a very it is a small or books, let's just put a little pitch for orbooks.com where you can order the book, but it's a very small house. It's a hands-on operation, and um yeah, it's they'll get to it when they can. Yeah.
I typically use an e-reader for mine, and what I'll do is just like a text-to-speech thing, so I can still listen to it
Mm.
while I drive.
I
Oh,
can't do that. I
I
don't
know.
like the voice. It's annoying.
you can't
Yeah,
change the voice to a different, like
You,
it's
you
you
can.
can. It's still
get Judy
annoying
Dench to
though.
read it or whatever.
But it's yeah, well, you can, and there are ways. There are some better readers than others. Some of the voices are terrible, but there are others that are pretty good at having better voices. Most of them cost money though, like
I don't want to pay.
subscriptions. Yeah, me neither. I don't like subscriptions. That's
Well, because there was no Audible, and I actually had not heard of, I mean, maybe because it's probably because I live in a bubble. Um, I probably don't live in a bubble as much as I think I do, but I had never
We all
heard
do.
of, and right, like I had never heard of Carlos Castaneda before, I was introduced to your book. And so I was like, well, what is, I was like, well, maybe I'll just listen to one of his books on the way home instead.
Oh
Um,
my goodness, that happened, huh?
but honestly, I could not. On the way there, I listened to it, but on the
Which book
way,
was it?
the
Which one?
teaching, but I couldn't get past the third chapter. I found the main character very annoying. And I, and there's like I don't know if it's the first or second chapter, but it's like talking about how he spent all night rolling around on the ground trying to find his spot. And I'm thinking the whole time, just go sit down. Just go sit down. Like, why does it take all night to find a seat? I was like, how am I supposed to think you are the chosen one when you take all night just to find out where to sit down? And I just lost it from there. And
It's
I think I
so
read,
interesting because that passage when it came out, that was something that seemed very, very meaningful to so many people. I'll talk to people today, and that will be, there are a few things people who have
mm,
forgotten about the books, but then they will remember, oh, but it's real, that thing about trying to find your spot. And yeah, it's really interesting. I was, thinking we might get into this later, but it's just when I, back in another era when I started this book, if I ran into somebody who was studying anthropology, they knew who Castaneda was, and that's no longer the case. So yeah, you're not living in a bubble. It's just the moment has changed.
so. I mean, for me, I heard about Castaneda, more about the Don Juan books when I was growing up. I think that was probably because there were some people in my family who enjoyed reading them.
Right.
Um, and as a matter of fact, on my mother's side, my grandmother and her sister both, if I remember correctly, had like they just had this huge collection of the like
Like
different.
a box set.
Yeah, exactly. And they were very much in, and I've talked to Ashley about my history regarding some of that, but very much into more of a new wave religious type things, and we're not going to go in too much detail on that because there's some sensitive subjects in the family about it. But I will say that they were very much interested in the quasi anthropological nature of that kind of book, and in particular, they had a lot to say about Don Juan. And I don't remember specifically them talking about the sleeping on the ground part, but I do think that that was very deliberate on Castaneda's part. I think that he he clearly understood like the average person's psychology enough to use the minor discomfort as a tool to kind of reach out and more of a like a touchstone for the average reader who's going to be interested in
Hmm.
that book. I think that that was, like I said, a deliberate attempt at connecting with specific types of readers.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. He knew what he was doing. He was
Mhm.
very, very sly. And I mean, I think one of the brilliant things that the books do is that without your knowing it, you become very, I mean, apparently Ashley didn't, but many people just become very identified with this kind of, quest that Carlos, or more accurately, the Carlos character is on in the books. And one, there are, kind of endless ways actually that you can show that these were, whatever you want to call it, a hoax. But one is, forget about whether or not there was a Don Juan, it's whether or not the Carlos character who's in the books bears any kind of resemblance to what we actually absolutely know about Castaneda himself, and not really. That's a fictional creation in the books, but it's, as you say, it's designed to become this protagonist that people very much identify with, and in particular, this idea of this questioning whether or not I am special, and this desire to be, unique and on this kind of path that will distinguish you from, all of these kind of, boring, ordinary, oppressive people in your family, which, yeah, it's kind of a widespread thing.
Yeah, it's a chosen one fantasy. I mean,
I
how
love that you pick up on that because it's something that like it's one of another like big tell in the book is that right at the very beginning um, Carlos, has Don Juan, who people really did believe at the time that this was a real figure, identifying him as the chosen one. And yeah, that's kind of a warning sign because we have this guy who's now president of the United States who said the same thing.
Mhm.
I don't remember the exact words, but I am the chosen one. And if somebody says that to you, I would suggest maybe making a polite exit.
Yeah, so I mean the whole chosen one thing, it's very like it's a well documented literary structure as far as our president goes, and without getting overly political, I will say that if somebody genuinely believes that they are a chosen one, there may be something uh I th- I don't want to say medical diagnosis that could be applied, but at the same time I'm going to say there's probably a medical diagnosis that could be applied there.
Well, there's certainly a lot of psychological and psychiatric literature.
Can we talk about who Castaneda is and what his, some of the brief
Just,
about
just
his
the,
life
the
story?
the basics. Carlos Castaneda was he was actually a graduate dropout from the graduate UCLA anthropology department in 1968, and we could, if you want, go through the whole story behind this. He managed to get the University of California Press to publish a book that was called The Teachings of Don Juan, which purportedly told of his initiation into this using peyote and datura and mushrooms. This was at the height of the psychedelic era, into this alternative mode of consciousness. People were very interested in, as they still are, and there's a renaissance in it, in exploring other kind of ways of consciousness. And what Castaneda did in those books was, as kind of no one really had before, was to really give it a very kind of a serious, almost philosophical sort of grounding for 5 years. And that book became, first it was kind of an underground bestseller, and then it became a nationwide and international bestseller. Probably at least on some level to Castaneda's surprise, and certainly to the surprise of, pretty much everyone who knew him. He wrote four books in pretty rapid succession. He became, by far the best-selling anthropologist and one of the best-selling nonfiction writers of the 1970s. only really rather gradually, did doubts and questions. I mean, people had many doubts and many questions, but they didn't emerge publicly for about 5 years. So very slowly his reputation declined, and just, to speed through this, he went on to become a cult leader, and, had thousands of people following him. And when he died in 1998, five women who were among his closest associates disappeared. And going back to what I was mentioning earlier, the remains of one were later found in Death Valley. And because he had been talking about this incessantly before they died, it does seem quite probable that they all killed themselves in order to travel with him into infinity. So it's a happy tale. No, I shouldn't say that.
What I always find, I think this isn't just a Carlos thing. What I find interesting about people, I guess, is,
Mm,
you discuss how people knew he lied. Even as at a young age, you discuss how he was a
right.
storyteller. And I always find it strange that people know somebody is a big liar, but still kind of keep them as a part, like as an active member in their life. Because I'm the type of person is, if I know you're a liar, I'm probably not going to associate with you and
That's
go about my day.
a great point. And the thing that I heard over and again was that he was just so much fun. He was, people would say, "Oh God, all I remember is that we were laughing our heads off." And it's not something that every liar can do. And it's not something that every cult leader does. But it's a very interesting thing when you cannot you begin to lose track of, like, what's a joke and what's real, or what's he serious about. And it provides this kind of, interesting deniability. And I don't mean to be harping on this, but it's actually something Trump does as well. It's like, we were can't you take a joke, we were just kidding. But there's this double layer to that. It's also, and these people I think are somewhat rare, but I've certainly encountered versions of it. Just people, he's charismatic. He was really able to hook you. Besides being an enormously entertaining person, when you met him in person, he had an ability, and I heard this again from many people, to just kind of lock into you and figure out very quickly, where you were coming from. Um, and uh, I want to say I'm agnostic about this, but I would actually lean into him being psychic on some level, just kind of being able to know stuff about that, whether that's just this kind of preternatural ability to really read subtle cues. And that's that's something, especially if it happens first meeting, very upfront, it will hook you into a kind of relationship with somebody. And what somebody like him knows, and I think what all of these people know, is that it's the emotional will override the rational every time. And it will do it whether you're just some whatever crazy hippie, or whether you are a professor at UCLA, or whether you write for the New York Times. It doesn't matter. And people have a lot of faith in their ability to, rationally discern things. But yeah, there's a shortcut around that.
He's definitely a student of psychology. He
Yeah.
had a doctorate in anthropology. So he also has
Studied,
a
I just
certain,
jump in that he studied psychology. He studied psychology. He first went to Los Angeles City
yeah.
College. He was a psychology major. He continued to take psychology
Yeah.
classes. He most likely worked as a teaching assistant
Mhm.
to somebody in the psych department. So yeah.
Yeah. So with a background like that, and I don't know enough about his background to say where some of this other behavior came from, but with a background like that, I'm just going to say I've seen other figures, like you said, that are very charismatic, and even in my own life, who have that ability to be that big liar, as you guys say, that really big liar who mix in these, jokes with the little comments that seem a little bit too real, but then they
mm,
play them
mm,
off. And
mm,
it's that smoke screen. They
mm,
want to test the waters and they're hiding it behind, shuffling the
mm-hmm,
deck really.
mm-hmm,
What's a joke, what's
mm,
real, what's not. And
exactly.
then all of that is, he's doing that. And I think every conversation that he had with all of these people was really designed to see what would bring them to his side. What exactly I'd be interested to see from different perspectives, without going too far into the book here, from different perspectives from the people that you've interviewed, how many of them caught any inconsistencies in his rhetoric, right?
Oh, I think many of them did, but again, it's if you really like somebody or if their, approval of you is very important, or if you've brought them on board with the project, people will overlook a lot of stuff. People will overlook the the inconsistencies or the kind of outliers until it reaches a point when they cannot. But that point can be pretty frigging deep in, and especially when it's in a social context, whether that social context be all of your colleagues at UCLA who think that Carlos is just the best thing since, whatever, sliced toast. I don't know, so great about that. But or whether you're, actually in a cult. And that's in a way really what a cult is this creation of this social unit where you are so dependent on the group that we have this idea that human beings are, independent modules, of rational thinkers, and not so much. Not so much. We're much more permeable, in my view, and I think this is something Castaneda knew full well than we like to think we are.
I do think that that's definitely a reflection on Western society as well, and
Yeah.
particularly in the United States, we have this idea of being very individualistic.
Hmm.
It's seen as a virtue, and you're supposed to specifically strive for that. So I think that makes us
Mm,
particularly vulnerable to his type of manipulation.
mm,
Um,
hmm,
I mean,
hmm,
obviously, this era was famous for its cult leaders and the cults of personality that kind of crop up around it. I think he used three main things really. He radiates this aura of I am not a threat. I'm gonna do what's
hmm,
best for
hmm,
you,
hmm.
and the I can't remember what I was thinking for the third. I apologize.
Well, just a really basic thing is like he lets you think that you are really
Yeah.
special.
Mhm.
Not just like, one of the top kids in the class, but this kid who, we have never ever seen any kid like you. And, especially in a world where people, really do not feel that their lives often have a lot of meaning or, they're just the tremendous sense of purposelessness that is out there to be able to tap into that almost, I don't know if it's infantile, but early childhood thing, where you maybe never felt somebody directing that at you since you were 5 years old. It's enormously powerful. And when somebody like Carlos, they don't have anything in them that says, well, maybe I shouldn't go too far. They're all in on it. And that's, in a way, a kind of a quality of charisma is this complete ability to be completely convinced. And charisma doesn't necessarily need to be malignant, but when it is, yeah, watch out.
Yeah. No, he was very, very good at, like you said, making people think that they were the center of the world. And I think that is kind of the appeal of going down that cult leader path in some ways. You're taking
Mm-hmm,
that chosen one narrative on yourself, but by taking that cult leader kind of positioning,
mm-hmm.
you're saying that I can bestow this upon the people who follow me.
Right. People see in that confidence that the charismatic figure has this. There's a whole, like Max Weber writes about this, that there's a promise that you will be able to transform yourself
Hmm.
in this tremendously powerful way and be a new person through. It's like it kind of shines a sort of light onto you.
Everybody's always looking for the answer, and
You know?
if you know how to smile right and promise them that you have it,
Yeah.
yeah.
And you have to, I think, convince yourself that you
Oh,
have it. If that's, I think, really the key thing is, I mean, I'm not sure if I say this in the book or not. I've certainly thought it, that the first follower of the cult leader is themselves.
yeah. Well, that's interesting because we were just talking about confidence, and then, I mean, the idea of a confidence man or a con man really does make me think that would be like the perfect type of person who could become a cult leader. But at the same time, like you said, they have to be able to believe in what they're saying. So where do you find that line, right? It seems like there's a little bit of self-delusion in there, and the question is, at what point is it impossible to look back at their own lies for them? Is it impossible for them to look back at those lies and think, you know, this part wasn't true, but I'm still right?
There's, maybe we'll answer with a tangent. There's a book by an Australian, I think he's a psychologist named Len Oakes that I found very useful in thinking about Castaneda. And he's writing about charismatic figures and messianic figures in general. And the trajectory that he outlines is it's usually somebody who at a certain point very early that's held up to be very, very special, and is an idealized child. Then reality kind of begins to set in or something happens, and they're not, but they have this tremendous need to kind of return to that, and they do that through kind of living in some kind of a fantasy world, and that will usually kind of coexist with other kind of modes of existence, or other belief systems about themselves. And then at a certain point something will happen which will convince them that, oh wait, actually I am the chosen one. And then they will, it becomes this self-reinforcing uh, circle. And yeah, I just found that because the way that he lays it out, it's like, yeah, it kind of happens for Castaneda's in his mid 30s when this great success begins to in his mid 30s, well, mid 40s, I'm sorry, happens to him. He says he's in his mid 30s, but he's actually in his mid 40s. He's midway through life, and that seems to often be how it works. They're not full on the whole way through, but something happens. I don't know. Yeah, I'm not going to keep going back to Trump, but oh, wow, I just escaped all those, court hearing, those trials. I got away with that, and the bullet missed my ear. I must really be the chosen one. And Castaneda's, he's like driving a cab around Los Angeles. He's dropped out of the grad program. He's written this book, and he expects that his hope is just it's going to be this little academic monograph, and it becomes an international bestseller. It's like, wait a minute, well, maybe the universe is telling me something.
So well, this may have been kind of a little small subjection what you said, but I did pick up on it. It happened in his mid 40s. So this could have really just started with a midlife crisis.
Absolutely.
I
He does
mean,
have a midlife crisis. He does. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, it's kind of interesting to think about that. And then if you look at it's just a really perfect storm of just bad timing for everybody except for him at that moment. In a way, he kind of was the chosen one. It's just for a terrible thing, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Whether or not the universe has meaning, I don't know. I would like to think it does. Maybe it's all part of some, bigger plan that we don't see yet. But yeah, a lot of stars aligned for him. But to give him credit, there's also some kind of intuition or perception that he has about what the moment needs. And it does go back to, on a personal level, he would probably know all sorts of things about you or sense them that I don't because I'm not that, maybe not that perceptive in a way. He could read people. And I've met people like that. I've met people who will do this kind of reading. And, maybe they're not always right, but often they are. And he read the culture too.
Cold reading is something that a lot of times you'll see that with a psychic or something else like that. Like
Mm-hmm.
you'll see this on the big cable psychics back in the day, like
Mm-hmm.
early 90s. They'll pick somebody from the crowd, and
Mm-hmm.
really for that to work, you just have to know some basic demographics. You need to know
Mm-hmm.
some generalizations about
Mm-hmm.
certain areas, cultures, things like that. And then
Right.
it's all like a matter of logic, right? If you know one thing, then you know another, and then they can kind of pick and choose what they ask about, what they pull forward, and like with his charismatic nature, and he's like who was that person? Who's the person that you mentioned? Said all they could remember was laughing, right?
Yeah. Several
When
people said that to me. Yeah.
when you have no when your guard is down so much that you can't just help but laugh with somebody, what are you letting go? What are you showing them? What are you telling them? I don't think I've ever
Mm-hmm.
had a conversation with somebody who I was laughing with that I didn't tell them a personal thing or a personal story.
Good point. Good point. Yeah. And I think also, again, that confidence kind of comes into play there because most of us would, hesitate or pull back, but he just keeps pushing through. I mean, there's a lot that's unknowable. As I said, I'm agnostic about this question of psychic capacity because I certainly heard it from enough people. I don't know. I don't know. It's kind of not my job. It's not my job to decide all of those things. My job is to, try as truthfully as possible to, put together, a coherent narrative that is, as honest as I can make it, drawing from the testimony, of the people who knew him. Because, I did kind of start with, oh, he was the most mysterious writer of the 20th century, and maybe I don't know if there's anybody in this century who's equaling it. But I'm like, he was a person. He lived. There were people who knew him, and once I found, one person that led to other people. And yeah, that was my path.
So, speaking of truth, you do mention in your, so you mentioned finding the truth when trying to write this book. And and the way you present it, I find very interesting because it's something I've been struggling with politics is, I have my friends on the right and I have my friends on the left, and then you look at their feed and it's like somebody's showing one
Hmm.
thing and then talking about the same exact topic and presenting completely different information
Hmm.
to support, their perspective. Um, but I find it interesting is how we have our own perspectives and we see the world a different way and we don't always consider the other information that's out there and how it's shaping other people's perspectives. Um, and you bring up so what is truth, right? And how people's memories change, people's going to have different
Absolutely.
perspectives. So when writing this book, trying to tell his story, how did you navigate that?
That's absolutely, I think that's really the central issue in the book because I mean, as we've been discussing, you're talking about somebody who makes lying, almost a moral mission or an art form for him, which I believe that it was. It becomes a particularly wild and difficult ride. But I think even without that, even without on the internet having, these people who are, deliberately putting out false information that is impossible for people to distinguish from the real information. And we're really in an enormous crisis about that. Even if you bracket that out, people still remember things differently. And my position is that when it comes down to it, that's what we have to rely on. We have people's memories and we have the stories that people make out of those memories. And everyone does that. Everyone takes their experience and, boils it down to something that will make sense when they relay it to others. But we're all sitting and placed in different positions and even, just being assuming everyone is being completely as honest as they can be, they're going to see it differently. So in this book, that was, many times a kind of an overwhelming problem. But what I tried to do, what I think is just as a biographer, you just need to try to be honest about that. You need to acknowledge that we do not have certainty about the past. We might have something, that feels very, very close to certainty, but often our certainty about the past is just based on the fact that we haven't interviewed enough people. If you interview one person, you've got that story and that's the story. But, just try it in your own family. If you come from a family, with multiple siblings and ask them about something that occurred 30 years ago, I very much doubt you're going to hear exactly the same thing. And even if we, had a video camera somewhere that was recording everything that happened in the universe, nowadays, we don't know if any of that's legitimate. Anyway, so, I'm kind of, adopting, I guess it's sort of a budget version of pragmatism, which, as I understand it, is, when you're saying that a statement is true or a statement about the past is true, that what you're really saying is it functions, it works. Not that it works to make it into, oh, a great story, because you got to watch out for that, because that's very, very tempting. It's like you pick the thing that works in a kind of narrative way. But does it work in terms of fitting in with the rest of what you know? Um, and you have to make a choice. And you can't always, in a big book like this, which at once was an even more enormous book, you cannot, acknowledge that every time that it happens. But I think the important thing is just letting the reader know that this process is going on. And also just kind of to go back to what we are talking about psychic stuff, I made it, my policy to not dismiss anything out of hand, even if I thought, I talked to people who had been abducted by aliens, who often turned out to, when I compared what they were saying with what we knew, from other records, were quite often as accurate or more accurate than people who had PhDs in sociology or whatever. So yeah, I just assumed everyone was telling me the truth as they had seen it and as they knew it, and you have to negotiate it and you have to acknowledge that it's a negotiation. That was a big answer.
Not at all. Earlier conversation actually has me rethinking this question a bit, but you briefly discuss in the book Castaneda's influence on anthropology, but in 1999, you have Amy Smith coming out saying she was furious when she found out his fieldwork was totally bogus. And I was curious how once people started realizing, well, his work wasn't true, how that started to influence the study of anthropology, or at least within cultural anthropology. But at the same time, it kind of seems like his name is disappearing through this new
Yeah.
generation of anthropologists. So has it really changed anything? Or are people just forgetting him now?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's one woman, and I'm not sure whether I can't remember this is off the record or not. I'm going to leave her name out of it. An anthropologist, from that era, and what she said to me was she just thought it was really schizophrenic because his influence, in her view, on the field was, pretty enormous. And when you look at literature from the time, it appears that she's right. And she's like saying it had a profound effect, but now nobody wants to talk about it. So it does to me, and I'm an outsider. It does seem like something that hasn't really ever been processed. And when I say his influence was enormous or was big, on one level, it's just because a lot of people entered anthropology because of him. He got people thinking about it in an entirely other way. And the other is, he's certainly not the sole factor for this, but he is important in kind of this takedown or reversal of the model where there's this, kind of superior, Western, to be a little bit cliched, white dude going and, looking objectively at the indigenous people and making observations and knowing more somehow than they do. And what the books do is, particularly the early books, they dramatize that being turned on its head, because as I said, the Carlos in the books is not the Carlos, who existed in reality, but that character is portrayed as this kind of, uptight rationalist person who goes and has, his mind blown and realizes that he doesn't understand anything at all. The kind of hat trick in it, or the twist of the screw is that the knowledge that is supposedly revealed to him isn't actually indigenous anything at all. So, yeah, it's a lot to process, but yeah,
It's just another wizard's apprentice, right?
yeah,
I
yeah,
mean,
yeah.
yeah, no, that's
Well, there can
it's
be valid things in something that's fake.
well, of
That's,
course,
that's an important thing to get across because people are like, "Oh my God, those books meant so much." I'm like, "That's okay that they meant
yeah.
that much to you."
No,
Yeah,
no, I absolutely agree, and I'll even, take examples from my own life, right? There are some times when just reading a novel or some other
yeah,
book has been hugely important in me just processing things just for myself, right? Whether
right.
it's trying, some of it can be escapism, but you still sometimes need to escape from reality is, when you're just looking at survival needs and all these things day after day after day, it's that constant pressure that can really really hurt you, right? Reading a book like this and thinking that it's real can cause some problems, but I think most people
Yeah.
can read these books and kind of see in between those lines and put together that this is, whether it's absolutely true or not, it's a story.
Think, it depends who you are and when you're reading them, what,
Sure.
again, perspectivalism, where you are. I mean, people, some people are like, oh, we knew that was bullshit from the
Yeah.
beginning, which I'm skeptical of because nobody said it in public, except, I mean, very, very few exceptions at the very beginning. Again, people's memories, can be a little bit tricky, but I, have certainly talked to enough people who still, buy it, hook, line, and sinker. And,
Hmm.
sometimes this, maybe has seemed to have a tremendously liberatory effect on them. Sometimes it's had a really, really the opposite, though, in the long run.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that goes into, the fall from grace, right? It
Yeah.
just look at like J.K. Rowling, for example. There are
What
so
does
many people.
it's not ethnography?
No,
What? Harry
unfortunately, I don't know
Potter?
how we.
What? Because
It's
I was
another
looking
wizard's
for
apprentice,
whatever
right?
crack 13 and a half or whatever it is. I
Hmm.
still haven't found it. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
But I mean,
All
even
right.
with all that, just look at how much that meant to so many people.
Right.
And then when
Right.
she had her fall from grace and she finally like voiced her opinion on certain things and people
Right.
started to realize, oh wow, this person's actually
It's really
not who I
hurtful
thought they
to
were.
people.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was very hurtful
Yeah.
for them. And maybe that's not quite a one-to-one example, but I think that definitely has that when you have that big
Yeah.
reframe, you start to see, okay, so actually I did have this thought. It didn't, I just kind of pushed it to the side at the time though, because they were wrapped up in that story that they
Mm.
wanted to hear. right? Everybody
Hmm.
who reads a story, everybody who watches a movie, in a lot of ways, they see what's on the screen, but they're only watching or they're only reading the story that is meaningful to them at that moment, you know?
Hmm. But you
Um,
also have to separate, make kind of a category separation between, the producer and the product.
Death of the author. Yeah.
Picasso was a big fucking asshole from what I could gather, and did some really terrible, treated women horribly. But I'm not gonna, dismiss his artwork because of that. The book is this, it's a product. It does come within a whole kind of social context, and that is maybe I need to think that through
Yeah.
a little bit more. But if you found also just going, speaking of Castaneda specifically, what he's doing a lot of the time is he's plagiarizing. So if you're plagiarizing something that is really, meaningful or beautiful or insightful, and a lot of what he's plagiarizing, he's borrowing super heavily from phenomenology. And this is how I learned about phenomenology. When I was a kid, I didn't know that was what I was learning about. That took me, till I wrote this book to understand that. But that's, cool stuff as far as I'm concerned. And it's not invalid because that's how it was transmitted.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Well, so part of the reason that I wanted to comment on that was that you mentioned that Don Juan books are a large part of why so many people got into anthropology in the first place. And that just reminds me of how many people I've talked to who got into anthropology or archaeology just specifically because of Indiana Jones, for example,
Huh,
right?
uh-huh, uh-huh.
There's a correlation there. And I mean, when you look back at even Indiana Jones, as admirable as that figure is, he's an antiquarian, which
Hmm.
if
Hmm.
you're in archaeology, you realize, well, he's really just a grave robber, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
He's taking artifacts from these people and he's selling them
Mm,
to a museum.
mm.
He's a grave
Seems a little
robber and he does it for
problematic.
profit.
Yeah,
It is very problematic, and
yeah.
he's framed as this hero, right? It's
Hmm.
just like Don
Hmm.
Juan, he's framed as this chosen one, hero figure, and
Interesting.
yeah, no, so it just I can see how that might lead a lot of people into wanting to become like that person. They want to become an anthropologist. They want to become, you know, that that leader figure
What
when
an
you walk
adventure. A
in.
great adventure. Great
Yeah.
adventure.
It's it's all about the adventure. And then you walk into it and you realize, okay, wait, this isn't quite what I thought it was.
Right.
And then that opinions change is kind of where I'm going with that one.
Well, I mean, just not just anthropology, right? You discuss how his books had a huge influence on pop culture, specifically on Star Wars, which I had not realized at all until you brought that up, right? This relationship between the father and son. But can you t further explain to our listeners how influential his books were, not just in anthropology, or
Well,
to things
in the
that
70s, it was, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was
Oh,
going to say to things that maybe are not anthropology listeners are
I
more
think it's
familiar with.
hard now, to kind of to convey just simply, how big those books were and how, they were on the New York Times bestseller list, I don't know if it was more than half the time, but throughout the 70s. And especially people, artists, musicians, the culturati, were very into them. Bob Dylan was a fan. There's John Lennon, remarks that Yoko Ono was his Don Juan. Joni Mitchell, one of her albums is called Don Juan's Reckless Daughter, and according to her biographer, she conceived of the title song as being like a conversation with Castaneda. So it's just kind of everywhere. But yeah, about Star Wars, and who knew this, but it's in the biography of Lucas that when he was writing the script for the first Star Wars films, he was, I believe, reading Castaneda's fourth book, was all into it, and the concept of the Force comes from the concept of power in the Don Juan books, which is something that is talked about, ad nauseum, and which we could delve into more if you want. But in his notes, notes for the script, it's he's conceiving of Obi-Wan Kenobi, and it's based on the Don Juan figure, and then the Carlos character is the Luke Skywalker character. So yeah, and even the name, I'm not sure if whatever, it could be true. Obi-Wan Kenobi, Don Juan.
So yeah,
So
that was definitely one of the chosen one concepts that I'd been considering when
totally,
we talked about
totally,
it.
totally a father.
Yeah.
It's the alt father. And
Hmm.
also I'd say just on the popular culture thing, there are other things. I don't know how much y'all, keep up with whatever current, I don't know, new age stuff, but so many of the people who are, within that world, popular, well regarded. Wayne Dyer was a huge Castaneda fan. Tara Brach, who, I listen to Tara Brach all the time, and she quotes Castaneda all the time. I'm like, oh, Tara, really, must you? Ram Dass, I love Ram Dass, and Castaneda was vicious. And he would have these horrible jokes about Ram Dass, but Ram Dass had no way of knowing that, and he, is referencing, and entirely believing, the Don Juan books in his talks. Another important kind of conduit to where we are now is Stuart Brand. Do people know who Stuart Brand is now? Hmm. It's okay to not know. It's okay to not know. He, was this writer. He's still living, I believe. He wrote this thing called the Whole Earth Catalog, which, Steve Jobs called it Google before there was Google. He's an important conduit between just generally kind of hippie communal culture and Silicon Valley culture. A number of people have written about that. He was a big Castaneda fan, and how this kind of influence works is, it's pretty much impossible to quantify, but there's this underlying kind of, I think, tension, in the counterculture of that era between communalism and, this kind of hyper individuality, which is, where Carlos very much lands, as opposed to Timothy Leary, who's, come together, let's all love each other and, dissolve in oceanic bliss. And Castaneda is no, it is like they're the superior few, and you can create your own reality. And yeah, Sergey Brin is a Castaneda fan. I don't know, if Zuckerberg ever read Carlos. There's no reason to believe he did. But if you think of, the idea of like the metaverse, it's very, to my mind, it's very Castaneda.
I wanted to hear a little bit more about
Yeah.
when the hikers, well, how did researching that experience go when you started to learn more about when they found his adopted daughter in the
Oh
was it the
God, we might
Mongolian?
need to do a whole other podcast about that. That's in 2003. There are these two guys were hiking in the Panamint Valley, in the dunes, and found the bones of a young woman who had originally been named Patricia Parton, who later became part of the cult. She was called the Blue Scout, they believed, and her given the name Nuri Alexander. And yeah, it's all gets very twisted and very dark. But Constaneda, calls he actually adopts her. He's also, of course, having sex with her because he's having sex with all the women, and that's an important aspect too, is that, the kind of sexual exploitation. So that's 2003 that her remains are found. They're not identified. It takes 3 years for them to do the DNA, and identify them as Patricia Parton, and that's February 2006. Which, who knows if there's meaning in the universe, or if there is, what it means. But that's when I started researching this book. Um, yeah, there's never, to my mind, been anything akin to an adequate investigation of any of this. And one of the reasons for that is that most of these women, as far as their families were concerned, had disappeared long ago. They hadn't heard from them in years because they had been told, as people in cults often are, to cut off contact. So they didn't know anything had happened. And then nobody in the group reports them missing, which is an important clue to understanding what the ideation of the group was. Then, I became quite involved in this for a while. I ended up, going with, the family of one of these women to Death Valley to try to actually do a search. We were blocked from doing that. I could go into the reasons for that, but one of the problems is that basically, law enforcement, generally they don't want to have another unsolved case on the ledger. And they also there's this kind of base assumption that when somebody goes missing, it's they don't want to be found and just stop making a big fuss over it. But they were not willing or able to understand this as a cultic thing. So they would not consider it's like there are all these women who no one ever reports them missing, right? I was able to get a report made. We were able to get a couple of reports made. So they would consider each of these as individual cases, but not as connected in any way. Um, and yeah, there had been some incidents in, Death Valley where through the failure of law enforcement to investigate, there had been, other missing people who had been, their remains had been found by independent people. And that had been terrible publicity for the powers that be up there. And that's, I think, basically why we got stopped. Whether or not that's the correct place to be looking for these, women, I don't know. It's possible, entirely possible, that the rest of them are somewhere else. But it is also, there hasn't been an advocate for it or an advocate with power. And there's also something I think of an element of like, cult people or people who they think are they're just considered weirdos and yeah, it's not taken seriously.
My thought here is, and I think you mentioned earlier that it was, correct me if I'm wrong, but a a group of, was it five women who went out there and may have committed suicide to kind of follow him?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I mean, so just as kind of a thought experiment, you can commit suicide or take poison pretty much anywhere, right? I don't see that being something that you need to travel out into the desert for. Maybe I'm missing something, but I'm wondering how many women went missing from his cult. And
There were five women who disappeared basically the day after he died. There were women who, at least as far as their families were concerned, had disappeared before, but that's a separate category. The
yeah,
reason for the desert, well, first, basically, they wanted to create a myth that Castaneda had not died, but had this was what had happens in the books, and they were talking about it for years before he actually did die. He was not supposed to die. He was going to turn into a ball of light and ascend up into the heavens. When he actually did die, they did not announce it. They appear to have tried to keep it quiet, and it appears that that was in order to sort of lay the groundwork for this kind of idea of miraculous evanescence into another dimension. So yeah, as far as it's why they would be in the desert, it's because, or in that particular desert, beside the fact that there's a lot of stuff about deserts in the books, um, it's because her bones were found there, so at least one of them was there. And that's at least makes it reasonable to hypothesize. It's possible, she went off separately. We again don't know. But Patricia Parton, who's the woman whose body had been found, had been, according to notes taken by people in the group, sent out to scout, abandoned mines. What for? So nothing is definitive, but the point about the suicide is simply, there has been absolutely no trace of them. And for the most part, these were people whose job, for the last quarter century had been, cult member or witch. They did not have any other kind of means of support. Rumors were rife of, Castaneda having, millions and millions of dollars, stashed away somewhere. But, he also spent, not on himself, he was not, a materialist in that way, but he was supporting, dozens and dozens of women for many years. And some of them had expensive tastes. And he was actually not great with money. So the financial data that we do have suggests there wasn't that money. And also, if they were somehow to have all gone off together and just one of them committed suicide, they didn't like each other. It's like it doesn't, pass my smell test that they're all living together on some mysterious island, with no kind of survival skills other than being witches, and teaching, Castaneda's movement technique that was supposed to bring about eternal life. Yeah, and just because they talked about it, they talked about it and they talked about it and they talked about it, that this was what, sometimes specifically suicide was talked about. More often they talked about, we're going to take the leap. It was talked about in metaphor, which goes back to the whole thing of like, how do you know what's, a fun and colorful story, and how do you know what's serious? It all gets woven together and it becomes a tremendous kind of mind fuck.
You mentioned it didn't pass your smell test. The middle of the desert is not a really good area for people to find you. If they're trying to
Exactly.
create this myth and they're like my one, I can't help but wonder whether she went out there on her own or if the others were out there or not. Uh, it seems more to likely to me that somebody was trying to hide it. Their deaths don't
They were
seem,
trying to hide it. They were trying, I
yeah,
mean, it's like they would have wanted to hide it. If your goal is to create a story of, I'm not, putting no shade on, Jesus or anything, but like of somebody, rising from the dead. And, we'd have to get into the particular psychologies of these particular women. But, Florinda Donner, who was also an anthropologist, who was really his number two, she was, I think, this is a whole other thing, her psychology, but she was all in on it. She's his Jelaine. Um, she's completely committed to this
mhm.
project, which may be very hard for us to comprehend. Um, but their investment in, or her investment in Castaneda being, a supernatural being was enormous. And when it goes back to the stuff about group psychology, when everybody is, telling the same story and repeating it and repeating it and repeating it, and your entire social existence depends on this group, um, breaking out of that is going to be a lot harder than you might imagine, even if it is at the cost of your life. Um, and again, I don't absolutely know it, but I think, Occam's razor would be telling us they probably all did it together. I'm not saying, anyway, we're simply in the I don't know territory. It's not inconceivable that Nuri went out separately, but given that the whole group was invested in creating, because Costaneda went to enormous kind of almost unfathomable lengths sometimes to create these kind of scenarios to get people, to believe in things. Um, I think they were committed to that project, and that it would make sense that it would, they're not going to just, shoot themselves in the middle of Los Angeles. That wouldn't have worked.
So them disappearing into the desert and trying to create this myth of him
Yeah.
not being dead. And we've seen that myth show up with other celebrities, obviously like Elvis and things like that. But it
Yeah.
really it reminds me. I don't know if you've read it, but it reminds me of the Dune books.
I'm going to make this confession. I never made it through the Dune
No,
books. So fill me in. Fill me in.
well, uh, just in brief, and I'm gonna show myself as a bad fan here because I can't remember anybody's names at the moment. The main character, Paul Atreides. Paul Atreides at the end of the first book, um, he forces the Emperor's hand and so on, and takes control of the Empire because he has control of the spice, which is this sort of quasi magical drug that opens your mind so that you can see beyond and do these
Mm,
calculations, allowing people to travel through space, right? Which I think you can, you mentioned the use of psychedelic drugs in the book as well. The second book, at the end of that second book, Paul Atreides goes off into the desert because he realizes that him as who he was would have been a very bad thing for the rest of the people that he was leading and so on. So he goes off into the desert and everybody believes he's dead, but there's this subculture
mm,
within the story that believes that he's going to return. He's going to be this messiah figure. And again, I'll reveal that I'm a kind of a bad fan because I really only liked the first two books. Um, didn't finish the third one, didn't read any of the others, so I don't know what happened beyond there. But as I understand it, he did come back eventually, right? So it just reminds me disappearing into the desert, and I think these books were written in the mid '60s. He didn't
I thought it
die.
was a little later. Uh-huh. Anyway, I don't know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I might be wrong. I thought that it might have been. I think it was '65 was when the first book came out, but I could be wrong. The whole point of that was just that it feels like they kind of borrowed from that story, and I think it was also written around the same
Mm,
time as well, it was written a little bit before Star Wars because Star Wars also borrowed a lot from that as well. Um,
mm, mm.
but
Interesting.
yeah, no, it just seems a very much like they were again trying to highlight that chosen one nature. He's going to go and then come back,
Right.
right? That whole
Right. Right.
What
uh,
is everybody's obsession with the desert? Like that is not the place I'd want to go to die.
A lot of
so
people
Uh,
do like Death Valley. That's what I'm told is it happens there. But it's interesting and it does seem like in a lot of religious I don't want to say mythology, but narratives, the desert plays a big role. The desert's amazing. I'm from the desert. It can be very trippy out there.
what desert are you from?
The Sonoran Desert. I grew up
Oh,
in Phoenix, Arizona.
okay.
You know, the suburban part of the Sonoran Desert.
That's fair. I grew up in Sacramento, so we're not exactly a desert, but we're a very arid
Yeah,
region. Having gone out to the Mojave Desert recently for a conference, I can see the appeal. There's a lot of life out there that is just kind of hidden,
right,
and
right.
I can see that whole again um, mystic aspect of this really leaning into
Yeah.
the mystery of the desert and using that as kind of a focal point of it. I don't know. This is just a random comment. It's
No,
not
totally.
important.
I feel the same way. I mean, it isn't important, and it kind of is important because, partly why I related to these books was that's where I'm from.
I don't like sweating and I don't like dirt, so I prefer not to be in the desert.
Okay, fair enough, fair enough. Go in February. Yeah, go in February and don't get out of the car.
Contrary to my occupation, I do not like nature.
Oh my goodness. Wow. So are you're an you do archaeology?
I do CRM work,
Uh-huh.
yeah. So I'm outside a lot.
What is CRM work?
So CR cultural resource management is like 80% of archaeologists work in CRM, basically working to
Uh,
like monitor construction and stuff to prevent
uh,
destruction of like sites. So that is, I do a lot of watching construction workers and documenting things, a lot of report writing. So yeah.
where are
I
you doing that in, around Sacramento or?
Oh yeah, all over. I mean,
Uh-huh.
California has sites everywhere. So I don't usually go outside of Northern California.
Uh-huh.
You just told me a story about having to hike through like dense bushes and
I
stuff.
did.
Yeah. So don't let her fool you. She may not like the outdoors,
No,
but
I can
it's
do a
more than
lot.
just watching things. She's
I do a lot. I don't want to do it, but I do it.
I can't
I
wait to
don't know
get
how I got in
started.
this career
Sounds like a
field, but
mixed, some mixed feelings or motives in there.
well, I feel like with the ADHD, my mind works better outdoors. I'm not in like to sit in
Uh-huh.
front of a computer is very difficult for me. But at the same
Right.
time, it's like a sensory thing where it's like, oh, sweat, oh, dirt. Like my body's like, ah.
Huh.
Mhm.
Huh.
So
Yeah.
my brain says one thing, but my body says another.
Does some elements of it appeal to your body, or does all of it seem like the plant, the I don't know, the
Not,
trees or anything?
not,
Yeah, not really. It's
yeah. So, okay, so when I was looking up the teachings on Audible, and I was like, should I waste my credit on this book? No, I wish I hadn't because I didn't get past the third chapter. But right, I'm like trying to go through the comments to see, okay, is it worth it? And you hear every other comment, this is fiction, this is fiction. And then even some people like, I love this book so much growing up, I'm revisiting it now and I don't really care for it as much as I did when I was a
interesting.
kid.
Uh-huh.
Um, and then you have that section at the end of your book talking about how you've actually had difficulties with the publications and how it was seen almost like your book was questioning authority. So I wanted to see if you could expand on that. And also if you see right because Audible right now also categorizes it as a Native American or spiritual or I think like history. I think it even might
Huh.
be under history, but it's
Oh
fiction.
boy.
So, I mean, do you see this changing?
Oh boy. Well, that's yeah, there's quite a bit of a story here. The book was sold in 2019 to University of California Press, which was Castaneda's original publisher, and which still publishes the first book, The Teachings of Don Juan. And it categorizes it several ways, but one of them is as Native American studies. So, anywho, I originally had a very supportive editor there. I was asked to cut the manuscript a lot, to the tune of almost 100,000 words. It was an enormous motherfucker. Um, and it went for outside review. It got positive reviews. It was said, make certain changes, and I did my best to do that. And 2 years later, I resubmitted it. And what happened then was that my original editor left the press, and I was kicked up to the big boss. And the original editor was like, "It's don't worry about anything. It's going to be smooth sailing from here on in." And then it was not smooth sailing at all. What happened was it went back to the editorial committee. From what I can discern, it was just read by one guy who was an anthropologist who was really, really defensive about it, and called my understanding of anthropology into question, and said things like, "Oh, that I did not understand what the word magic in an anthropological context." The word appears only one time in the book in anything where you could consider it a kind of a technical anthropological term. Mostly it's like, "Oh, she thought it was a magical evening." I'm like, okay, what is this guy's problem here? And I showed that report to a friend of mine who's an anthropologist, not in any way connected to University of California. And going back to what you were asking about, he said, all they're saying is how dare you question our authority? Because, we anthropologists love to, critique each other and critique the discipline, but you're an outsider, just who the hell are you? So that led to the book being sent out again. This time, this round, it got rave reviews from an anthropologist, but I was taken to task by a sociologist of religion. And I talk about this at the very end of my book. There's this thing I knew nothing about beforehand called the cult wars, which is a battle in academia mostly between sociologists of religion who have been dominated for at least 30 years by people who are called the cult apologists, who are saying cults are just persecuted minority religions and do not use the word cult. And they're the cult alarmists, who tend to come more from psychology, from pretty much the rest of the universe. We're like, yeah, this is a thing, and I'm like, yeah, this guy, told these women to go commit suicide to follow him into another dimension. I think I really am justified in using the word cult. And this guy wrote a 7,000 word, denunciation of me, and I spent the next 6 months coming up with a response to that, and then waiting for the book to go out for a third time. And when it came back, it was like, yes, you're right about the cult issue. That's okay. But now, they'd had the book for 3 years. Now we want you to cut another 50,000 words from it. And we want you to put back in this material about social context, which you took out after the first round. And no, we cannot guarantee that even if that happens, there will not be other objections that will come up. And I was like, I do not know that these people really have any intention of actually publishing this book or of publishing it in any kind of form that will have to do with what I wrote. And it brings up, really interesting issues about institutional allegiance, because I was optimistic enough to kind of delude myself into thinking, well, it's been 50 years. All of these people are no longer on the faculty. But yeah, I was kind of shocked by that, and I did not help matters while this was going on by following up on a discussion I'd had with my first editor by writing to the press and saying, hey, just want to know, since this is part of the story, whether you have any plans, University of California Press, to recontextualize how you're presenting the teachings of Don Juan, which they're still calling Native American studies, and not giving any hint to the reader of any kind, any problem with the book. And I'm like, just to be clear, not saying don't publish it. I don't believe that. I don't believe in any kind of censorship. But I also, believe that there is some kind of contract with the reader. And I got, I was basically completely um, stonewalled on that. And yeah, I just did not think that, in order to preserve the book's integrity and just my own integrity, after having been kept in limbo for 3 years, that I could continue with them. Does that answer the question?
Yes. Yeah, I find it just
Yay! And it's
I
like,
find it
oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
oh no, I was just saying I find it so weird that when I go on and I look up the book, it's still like Native American Studies, and I'm like,
It used to
why?
be anthropology. It was, and I wrote something I left out in telling the story of this is, I had said, oh, my agent said write a little nonfiction piece, which I wrote in 2007, an article in Salon, which was not all that short, and which I knew just barely touched the surface about it. And at that time, it was still being published as anthropology. I don't want to give myself. I'll give myself a little credit. It's like after that, Simon and Schuster, who's, his major publisher, believe they changed that and they stopped classifying it as nonfiction. But, the publishing industry, and I hate to say it, academic publishing is part of it. what they care about is selling books. And, I'm going to just dig into this a little bit more because there is an ethical issue here. Because if these books, beside the fact of like, oh, it's kind of weird that, I've never checked what it is on Audible, but how these books are presented to the public, it has consequences. He never, ever would have been the phenomena he was were it not for the University of California's seal of approval. And that had very real consequences for people's lives. There would not have been a cult if it had not been for that. It's just if these had been published as novels, there isn't, to my knowledge, maybe there's a Dune cult out there, but if Dune had been published, yeah, you have to think of it as being published as nonfiction, and this leads, as we've been sketching out, to some, actual tragic consequences for actual real people. And I find that complete, this is not the biggest sin in the world. There are much bigger sins that happen in the world and even in publishing, but the total lack of concern or responsibility for those consequences is unsettling.
Comments last before we wrap up? You look like you were doing research right now.
Sorry. Yes, I was.
Oh, is there a
Um,
Dune cult? Did you find? Are they out there?
I did not find a Dune cult. I was looking into the first book, Teachings of Don Juan, and because you keep mentioning the University of California, LA, and I was
Ooh,
yeah.
dear.
So I went and looked, and I'm like, okay, so this was originally published as his master's thesis, right?
Yeah,
Which
that's a whole side weird thing. He thought that that was what it should be, what he wanted it to be. It was anyway. It doesn't really matter. It's
it definitely seems kind of
quite a thesis. It's quite a master's thesis.
I
It's
was I would yeah I might
they're
actually have
usually
to
like
read it.
20 pages, or
It
if you
might
don't.
have just like started off like I'm a broke master student who can't afford to do field work, so I'm gonna make it up.
Well, I
Maybe.
think there's, yeah, I mean, I don't know if you guys need to wrap this up, but we could go on, about that. I think he probably had, kind of multiple ideas about it. But yeah, anyway, it really starts in a way as an assignment. There's an assignment in a class he takes in 1960 called Methods of Field Archaeology, which is, and the assignment is, this is just how it was put at the time, interview an Indian. And I think Carlos was just like, I'm just going to interview myself.
Well, I mean, yeah. So this seems kind of I'm skeptical of anything that uses sorcery as a descriptive term. So,
Okay.
but it also said that it was scrutinized for academic fraud. So I think we came full circle on that one. I would just say last comment, and then I guess we can wrap it up unless Ashley has other questions. But um, it there's a huge variation within the field of anthropology, but it does strike me as strange that somebody who claims to be an anthropologist would react the way they did to you trying to publish a, any
Yeah.
kind of book like this, right? You're questioning authority is part of what we teach. It's important to question authority and to check things. Academia is not an ivory tower, as they say, but um, it is important to question what is considered known. You should learn the basics and be able to rely on those. But all of this, I mean, when it comes to science, it's all comes from, the real world defining itself. It's observation,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Sorcery is like saying, aliens did it. I can see the same. There's a
Well, there's literature, there's other, but it's not my area of expertise.
I
But
wouldn't call that
yeah,
literature, but
anyway.
that's my
Well, okay,
that's
okay,
just my opinion on on
yeah,
the subject. I'm not an
yeah.
expert either, so
Um, can I do my last little pitch?
yeah.
Um, if you want
Yeah.
to, I don't know when this is going to be aired, but right now, if you want to pre-order the book or books.com, or you can order it, any of those other, you know, huge, enormous corporations have it for sale too. Hi, yeah. And if you want to order the book, it's American Trickster, The Hidden Lives of Carlos Castaneda, and I am Rue Marshall, and you can order it directly from the publisher. That's orbooks.com, ORBOOKS.com, or yeah, anywhere that books are sold. It's available.
Thank you again, Rue, for being on the show with us today. For those of you listening, we were discussing American Trickster, The Hidden Lives of Carlos Castaneda. You can order online. If you are watching on YouTube, go ahead and give us a like and subscribe. For the rest of you, you can find us also on Apple Podcast, Audible, and Castbox. And thank you again. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you all for listening. Distribution of Anthropotamus is in collaboration with the American Anthropological Association. Please continue to follow us on Instagram and Twitter @Anthropotamus for our latest episodes, show notes, and book discussion schedule.